It's round 3 of the FIDE Candidates tournament in Toronto, and in this video I'm going to show you the game of the day with the main role for Praggnanandhaa. The young Indian boy is playing very enterprising chess. He's the crowd favorite, but unfortunately for him, he's only having a half a point out of 2 games. He lost in round 2, very unfortunately, against Gukesh, and his opponent in round 3 is Vidit. Vidit is having a great start with his first 2 black games, scoring 1.5 point out of 2. And of course, very impressive was his victory against Hikaru Nakamura with the black pieces. Now, Vidit playing with the white pieces against Praggnanandhaa. This game you don't want to miss. It's a very crazy game, very interesting game what's happening here. So also make sure to check out more videos on this channel if you would like to follow the Candidates tournament more closely. So here we go. Vidit starts the game with the move 1e4. Prag goes for e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and a6. So we get one of the main lines of the Spanish. At least that's what you would expect now if black would go for the move knight f6. But here, very interesting decision by Praggnanandhaa. Look at what he's playing here. The move f5. That is something you would not expect in a Candidates tournament. It's one of the sharpest modern lines out there for black to play against the Ruy Lopez. And it's a very tricky system. Actually, I've studied this line myself quite a bit, and I recorded for ChessBase also a 60-minute video course on this specific line, as I believe it's a really great surprise weapon. As I played it in a game myself in the Dutch League in 2022 against Dutch Grandmaster Friso Nijboer, who started to spend here a lot of time. In the end, he decided to play the move d3, which is not so critical. Of course, there's the possibility also to take on f5, but in that case, black gets the chance to advance the pawn to e4. And, well, black is already having a very comfortable game here. So that's something you could check out. If you're interested, make sure to have a look at my 60-minute video course, in which I'm also mentioning, of course, the main challenge here for black. It's the move d4, trying to open up the center to prove that a move like f5 is really weakening black's king's position in the center. But Prag is of course very well prepared for it. E takes d4. White now advances the pawn to e5, making it harder for black to advance the d pawn anytime soon. The pawn on e5 is looking great. Black goes for the move b5 to hit the bishop on a4, bishop to b3. And now another small surprise, I would say, because so far in recent years, most people have played here the move bishop b7 with the idea later to put a knight on a5. But Prag comes up with another small surprise as he played the move knight to a5 immediately. And of course, this is probably not 100% correct what black is doing, but being caught by surprise, you don't expect this, especially not for this specific game. Vidit was already spending quite a bit of time. There are a lot of options. You can take the pawn on d4 with your queen. He decided instead to take with the knight. And now the bishop goes to b7, another big moment in the game as black is sacrificing the pawn on f5. And of course, everybody wants to know what happens if you just simply capture that pawn on f5. Well, good news for all of you. This was played in the game. I should just mention that other possibilities are normal developing moves like castling kingside or knight c3 with very complicated play. But knight takes f5 was played, but here black swaps the bishop on b3. White recaptures with the a pawn. Now the big move here by black. It's the move d6, and this may come as a huge surprise. Probably you have absolutely no idea of what's going on here. But the idea basically of black's play is that after taking the pawn on d6, now the d7 square has become available for the queen. You're hitting the knight on f5, which is the only active piece. All the other pieces of white, they are still on their initial squares. And in one earlier game, there followed the move knight e3, but after bishop takes d6, followed by castling queenside, black obtains tremendous play for the pawn with fantastic bishops, open files, great attacking prospects here. Well, in the end, after something like queen d7, probably the way to go is to play something like queen h5 check. Then you can go g6, provoking that move. The queen goes back to e2. And after king f7, it's anybody's game. With the rook coming over to e8 very soon. The knight is hanging on f5. It's very sharp, but black is all right. Anyway, this was not played. E takes d6 is not a game's continuation. Vidit went for the move queen e2, which also looks very interesting, as it does put a bit of pressure against the king on e8. But look now, queen d7 is played anyway. So after taking the pawn on d6 with a discovered check, then we have this move king f7 with the transposition to the line I've just shown to you. Rook e8 is coming next, and I think it's pretty okay. By the way, it's not an exact transposition, because in that particular position the pawn was on g6, but it's more or less the same, and in any case, black is having a great time here. So, instead, after queen d7, Vidit played here the move e6. And this reminds us of the game of Praggnanandhaa yesterday in round 2 against Gukesh, in which he also sacrificed a number of pawns just to get a pawn on e6. And that pawn was kind of a nuisance, but black managed to untangle himself and find a way to play around that annoying pawn. Here, the queen goes to c6. So here, the queen and bishop working nicely together, hitting the pawn on g2. And, well, white got to think about how to deal with that. Castling kingside is not an option, because then you're getting just mated on that g2 square. f3 is a possibility, but it's not very active. Black will continue with moves like knight e7, and the game goes on. Black is all right there, probably. So, after queen c6, bishop to g5 is played. So, here we see the king is not able to castle now. And there's a little trap here, because taking the pawn on g2 cannot be recommended. In fact, it's a nice little tactical exercise here for yourself. Pause the video, think about how to review this move, and then knight takes g7. That is just mate in 3. It's check. You got to take the knight. Queen h5. Another check. King goes to f8, and then it's queen f7 with checkmate. So here you understand that knight takes g7 is a huge threat. g6 is played here to attack the knight and to prevent this queen h5 idea. And the knight got to move. If the knight goes to d4 to hit the queen, well, there's queen takes g2 with a double attack, and white is going to lose material. So instead, the knight comes back to e3. By the way, just one other point I wanted to mention is that you don't really have to move the knight. If you play something like knight c3, you can still not take on f5 because of queen h5 with checkmate. However, by playing this last move g6, you do now threaten to take on g2 as well. So the funny thing is that with the move g6, you're not threatening to take the knight on f5, but you do threaten to take the pawn on g2. Therefore, knight e3 played anyway. Black kicks the bishop away with the move h6. Where's the bishop going? If the bishop goes to h4, there's queen e4, which is annoying, and the bishop is hanging. Also, the pawn on e6 is likely going to drop, so the bishop went instead to f4. And now I was thinking, why not to play this move queen e4 anyway, with the same sort of double attack? But I think here Vidit's intention had been here to proceed with the move knight c3. When you are not able to take the bishop, if you do take the bishop, it's knight to d5, attacking the queen, attacking the pawn on c7. If you do take on d5 the other knight recaptures, and the knight fork on c7 is coming back into position again. However, queen takes e6 is a possibility, so queen e4, it's not a bad idea at all, but I think the move played by Pragg is also very understandable. He played here the move knight to e7. This is a great idea, because white would like to continue with its idea of completing the development. Something like knight c3 is tempting, but then there is the move b4, and the knight on c3 is in trouble. And here we see the point of the knight on e7, as the knight from c3 cannot jump into the d5 square. So knight e7 is a good move. White therefore first play the move c4. to get a better grip on the d5 square, and knight c3 is coming next. Well, black prevents it by playing the move b4. The knight can't go there. And well, there are still a number of options. You could consider a move like knight d2, but black is about to complete development with something like bishop g7 anyway. Look what Vidit played here in the game. He went for this move, queen g4, which is very subtle idea, because you're thinking that the pawn on g6 is not really threatened to be taken. It's defended by the knight. But if you're playing the careless move bishop g7, white's plan is to deflect that knight from e7 with this move knight d5. Black is completely lost here. If you do take on d5, there is first queen takes g6 and black's position is falling apart. So with queen g4, white is threatening this move knight d5. How to deal with it? Well, Pragg played here this move queen c5, so that the bishop has now this open diagonal. It also guards the d5 square. And the queen is also pretty well placed on the 5th rank, guarding a lot of squares over there. Castling kingside played. Now the bishop comes to g7. White develops the knight to d2. And here, finally, we got to make a decision. What is black going to do with its king? That's the big question we have been waiting for. Castling kingside looks like it's the safest way of playing, with the plan of going for rook f6, rook af8, and I like the harmony in black's position. Looks like black is having quite some control over the central squares, also thanks to the beautiful bishops on these long diagonals. But instead, black decided here to castle queenside, which in fact is a mistake which remained unnoticed by both players, because here white could have gone for this move knight d5. As we see, white once again wants to get rid of the knight on e7. If you do take on d5 with the knight, there's this discovered check with the pawn. The rook can block, but then you take back on d5. Now queen takes d5 can be played, and it looks like white's position is falling apart at first, but this pawn on e7 is still there. Knight c4 would be a great spot for the knight. And there are all sorts of tactical ideas, including bishop takes d6 moves, for instance, with knight fork coming into b6 if the pawn from c7 is gone. And tactically, things are working out quite well for white. White is very active also with plans of playing rook a1, rook fe1 to support the pawn on e7. Very complicated position, but this is what white should have done. And the fact that it was not played, well, it shows also that both players were seeing something along the way. Anyway, Vidit played here this move h4. So I guess that he wanted to avoid any sort of back rank issues later on, but also preventing the pawn from coming to g5 very soon. But now it's rook de8, and now this knight d5 idea no longer makes sense, because the rook is no longer on d8, so the discovered check with e7 is not possible. White played here the move rook ad1, trying to play it active with the rook. I mean, you're just leaving your pawn on b2 on pre, and it was captured. But the alternative is to play passively, but then anyway, rook hf8, and I think black is trying to find a plan to wrap up the pawn on e6. I do absolutely prefer black in this case. So rook ad1, understandable move, but the pawn on b2 is captured now. Knight d5 is played here anyway. So knight takes d5, c takes d5. Now protected passed pawn. So the pawn on d5 needs to be taken. You can't take with the queen, because it runs into this move knight to c4, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop, and there are all sorts of problems here for black. So black instead captures with the bishop, and the pawn on e6 is under threat. Now you do have the option to support it one more time with rook fe1. I think that rook belongs to the e file to try to support the advance of that pawn. But instead e7 check was played. King goes to b8, and here now rook fe1 will come too late, because there's rook h7, and you're just attacking the pawn on e7, and the pawn will probably be lost. If you do play something like queen d7, there are always ideas even just to play bishop c6 for instance. So yeah, I don't think this is gonna work. White instead played here the move bishop e3, attacking the queen. The queen goes to b5, keeping the pawn defended. You don't want white to capture the pawn with check. Knight comes into c4, it hits the bishop, and you also don't want to trade off the bishop for the knight. So bishop to c3, bishop is now very well supported by the pawn on b4. The bishop goes to d4, and here we see that white is trying to get rid of that annoying bishop. If you do take, you can take with the queen, and well, there's a bit of pressure against the rook, which means black doesn't have time to take on e7. So black instead is going to move the rook. He went to g8 to keep the rooks connected. Very logical that with the pawn on e7, you want to maintain control over your back rank, avoiding any tactical problems perhaps. But rook h7 is the attempt to wrap up the pawn instead. It does hang the pawn on g6, so I assume this was the reason Pragg didn't go for this line. After rook takes e7, the pawn is gone. And the big problem here for white is that rook g8 is coming very soon, as the bishop guards that square, so that if the rook comes there, the queen will be under threat, as well as the pawn on g2. So black is in really good shape here. Anyway, back to what happened, because the action is not over here at all. Rook hg8, defending the pawn on g6. Bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and still, from practical point of view, I would believe that black is clearly better here. But apparently there is still a way to hold on, and I think it's an incredibly tough move to find. I think Vidit had already spent a lot of time. He was under 10 minutes to reach the 14th move, the time control. If he would have gone here for something like knight a3 to move the knight away, to hit the queen, he's probably still doing all right. Of course, the pawn on b3 cannot be taken because of rook b1, and white does win the queen. There are a lot of other squares for the queen to go to. But for instance, if you play something like queen c6, I like this plan of getting your knight back to c2 with ideas of knight b4, pressure against the bishop. Well, there's still also pressure against the king, so white is still fighting here, but very complex, very complex. Anyway, queen d4 is a much more human continuation. Why on earth would you think about moving your knight away to the edge of the board? The knight is pretty well placed on c4. It's not doing too much, but more active than on a3. And with queen d4, you're attacking the bishop, you're intending to win the pawn on c3. So the bishop went back to b7. Could have gone even to a8, which is a move which is preferred by the engine. After bishop b7 though, queen takes c3. White is having now back that pawn, but black captures on e7. So black is still a pawn up here. But white is trying to fight with the move knight a5. You're trying to eliminate that powerful bishop at some point. And therefore the bishop could have gone perhaps better to a8 instead. But here rook e5 played, attacking the knight on a5. And still, I think black was kind of relieved to get this sort of position. The complications are more or less over. If you do take on b7, you're still guarding your king pretty well. Your pawn up as black, although white with a move like rook d4 still has drawing chances here, I would say. But instead, Vidit played here the move b4. He wanted to keep the knight on the board, but this knight is a pretty bad piece. And look now, black goes here for the move g5, seizing the initiative on the king side. If you do take that pawn, it's rook eg5, and white cannot withstand the pressure against the pawn on g2. If you do play g3 to take away that pressure, there's rook h5, mating threat on h1. Knight takes b7 doesn't change that at all, because black renews the mating threat. You can't move your f-pawn. Pawn on g3 will be hanging. So white is completely lost here. So instead of taking on g5, white goes h5, trying to keep the position closed. But there is this move, g4. Black doesn't hold back, advances the pawn to g4. Now, after rook f e1, Black continues with the move g3. Incredible idea, intending to open up that g file for the rook on g8 to hit the pawn on g2. Now, if white would play f3, there is queen b6 check, and it's going to be mate. If you go king h1, it's rook takes h5, checkmate. If the king goes to the other side to f1, it's queen f2 with checkmate. So that is not possible. And taking on e5 just runs into g takes f2 with check. You have options to take on g2, take on e5. This is just really bad for white. And well, something very similar happened in the game, as instead of taking on e5, they followed knight takes b7, eliminating that bishop, but still g takes f2, counter check, intermediate move, king takes on f2, now queen takes b7, material, black is still a pawn up, but with major pieces only, and that's what I've been telling almost in all my videos on the channel, with major pieces only. It's all about king safety. Look at that white king, it's wide open, and you're just getting checkmated. Now black is threatening to take on g2, so if you, for instance, would play g3, it's rook f8, and the king got to go back to g1, but then it's rook takes h5, black is 2 pawns up, and even threatens checkmate. So that doesn't work. White instead played here the move queen f3, trying to bail out to a really bad rook endgame, but rook eg5 is also a beautiful move to hit the pawn on g2 one more time. Queens are coming off the board, and now both the pawn on h5 and on g2, they're both hanging. If you go rook g1, rook takes h5, black is up 2 pawns, game over. g4 was played by Vidit. Nobody understands what the exact idea is. The game is just over here. Rook takes pawn, rook e6. White is trying to win this pawn. He can get that pawn, but after rook h4, rook takes h6, you go rook g5, and that h-pawn will be eliminated. Rook h7, rook takes h5. Now, if rooks are coming off the board, it's just 3 versus 1 with an easy win. So white played here the move rook to d7, setting up a very small trap here with rook 1, d takes d6 on the agenda, as pawn on c7 is pinned. After king c8, attacking the rook. Now the pawn on d6 can no longer be taken. Rook went back to e7, and now very simple technique, offering the exchange of rooks. Rook goes to g7, and now it's rook h2 f5. And here white resigned, because after king g2, one pair of rooks will come off the board, and then it's 3 versus 1. Likely you win the pawn on b4, or you trade it off for the a-pawn at some point, and then it's 2 versus 0, and that's just, of course, an easy win. So what an incredible way of bouncing back by Praggnanandhaa. After this loss with the white pieces against Gukesh, he played fantastically. He really tried hard. He took a lot of risks in the opening, surprised his opponent, calculated better, and fully deserved to win this game. So he is back to 50%. And that's also the case for Vidit. A painful loss for him, but still 50% for both players. It was the only victory of the day, so 3 players are still in the lead. Let's see what's going to happen in round 4 of the FIDE Candidates. And one little favor asked from me, please do like this video, if you like it at least, and also hit the subscribe button. Thanks for doing that, and we will see each other very soon again. Bye bye.